Hey guys, welcome to Intelligent Faith 315. My name is Pastor Jay. I run the website here and we have a little team put together. We're glad you've joined us. Today we're going to be continuing in our series, Good Arguments for God's Existence. Have you ever asked yourself, is there any way to know? Is there any way to quote-unquote prove, or at least make it very plausible, very demonstrable, very believable that it's likely that a personal God or a personal creator exists? Is there any way that we could know that kind of a thing to be true? Is it just the case of wild speculation? Is it something that has to be believed just by quote-unquote blind faith? Or is there any type of rational, logical reasoning we can kind of bring to bear in the situation and try to determine if the concept of God even makes sense, if there's any way that we can kind of think rationally about that question? Does God exist? Well, if you've ever asked those type of questions for yourself, especially if you've ever looked for evidence or argumentation, then hopefully you'll enjoy this series, because that's precisely what we're talking about here. We're going through some different arguments for God's existence. This could be called classical apologetics, traditional arguments for God's existence, or you could also call it philosophical apologetics. What we started off with last time is we had an introduction, but then we began to get into an argument from sufficient reason from a man named Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. So he's a German mathematician from about the 1700s. And so we're going through his argument from sufficient reason, from contingency. It's a cosmological argument for God's existence. Later on in the series, we're going to be covering the axiological argument, which has to do with morality and how that points to the existence of a personal God, personal creator. So there's the axiological, then also the teleological argument, which is the design argument that points to the existence of a designer of the cosmos or of living systems. So that'll be pretty interesting. But then also later on after that, we'll get into a conceptual argument, the argument from consciousness, and maybe some other things. But to start off with, as I said, we're looking at the cosmological argument for God's existence. Well, what on earth is that? What in the heck is the cosmological argument for God's existence? Well, the cosmological argument focuses on the cosmos. This is the Greek word for world, or in modern day language we would say universe. So contemplating various aspects of the universe, it seeks to look at an aspect of the universe, perhaps that the universe necessitates, it needs a first cause, and then it argues from there to the fact that God must be that first cause. So the cosmological arguments look at the universe and then try to reason their way plausibly to the existence of a personal creator. If you remembered, most of these arguments have just a couple of premises, and then they have a conclusion. Some are shorter than others. Some may be just 3 steps. Others may be 4 or 5 steps in terms of the steps of the premises leading to the conclusion. And also quickly, remember, a good argument needs to be veridical. The premises need to be true. It needs to be logical. They need to follow the rules of logic, also known as the laws of logic or the first principles. If it's veridical, if it's logical, and if it's also plausible, if it's more likely true than not, if it can actually be known by people, then you've got a good argument. It's what they call a sound deductive argument. And that is the type of reasoning we're going to be using. Not inductive reasoning as is used in the field of science, but rather deductive reasoning. So we're going to be arguing from that viewpoint. So let me just review the argument that we covered from Leibniz, which is a cosmological argument, again, about the universe, talking about a sufficient reason, a sufficient explanation for this question. Why is there anything rather than nothing? That's a huge fundamental question in philosophy. Why does anything exist as opposed to nothing? There has to be a good answer for why we are here as opposed to not being here. Why is there a universe as opposed to there not being a universe? Might God have something to do with that? Well, let's find out. So premise number 1, which we'll be talking about today, is this. Everything that exists has an explanation for its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or an external cause. So we'll talk about that. And then number 2, we talked about if the universe has an explanation, that explanation is God. Premise number 3 says, well, the universe exists, and then it would follow logically and inescapably that the explanation of the universe is therefore God. If there are no mistakes in the premises, if they're logical, if they're plausible, then that is the conclusion that follows, that the sufficient explanation for the existence of the universe is God. But then, of course, as I said, the question remains, are they good premises? Can we find any mistakes? Is it logical, is it plausible for us to believe these premises, let's say, as opposed to their negation? Maybe a different idea is more plausible or more logical than this. Well, let's just go through these step by step, and this is how you can try to determine the soundness of a deductive argument, is just examine the premises one by one and try to see if you can find a mistake. Try to see if you can find any kind of a logical error, anything that might be a chink in the armor of the argument, so to say, which would make it fail. So let's look at premise number one again. Let me read it for you. Everything that exists has an explanation for its existence. Either, and here's these two categories, in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. So let me just ask you, does that seem like a plausible, reasonable idea? Does that seem like it makes sense? That everything that exists has an explanation. And mind you, God is not exempt from that premise. If that seems to be plausible to you, and it doesn't have to be 100% absolutely guaranteed with logical necessity and mathematical certainty, we're not operating under that kind of certainty with these arguments here. We're just simply asking you this. This is the burden of proof, so to say. If these arguments are more probable than their opposite, more probable than their negation, then it's a good argument. You should accept it. So let me just ask you that question. Does it sound plausible to you, the viewer, whether you're in Latvia, Ukraine, China, Germany, US, Puerto Rico, wherever you are? Does it seem plausible to you to expect or to think that everything that exists has an explanation for its existence? Does that seem plausible to you? It does seem plausible to me. Because what would the opposite be? The opposite would be that, well, things can just exist without a cause. Things can just come into being without any reason whatsoever. Now, if it does seem like a plausible premise to you that everything that exists has an explanation, and then there's those two categories which we'll talk about, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause, if that premise makes sense to you, then you can just accept it and move on to the next premise, which we'll cover next week. But if it doesn't make sense to you, or if you'd like to maybe analyze it a little bit, or maybe try to see how you could talk somebody through it to help them understand that it does make sense, well, then you should stick with it for a little bit and just see. But if that premise does make sense to you, or if it does make sense to a person you're sharing this with, you can just keep on talking very respectfully, very gently, but you can just go on to the next premise. That's kind of how this works. So, as I said, everything that exists has an explanation for its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. So in the thinking of Leibniz in the 1700s, I think it's actually 17th century, in the late 1600s, not the 1700s. But, and so what he's thinking of here, he's actually dividing all beings into two different categories. And you may have never heard of these categories, but I just need to explain this to you so it can help you make sense of this. Because even God is included within this. There's other cosmological arguments where we say, for example, everything that begins to exist has a cause. Now that wouldn't apply to God. Why? Because God doesn't have a beginning. He does not begin to exist at a certain point. Therefore, he needs no cause. God himself is the uncaused cause. But don't worry about that. We'll get to that in the Kalam cosmological argument. But for this one, this premise does apply to God. Everything that exists has an explanation of its existence. And there's two types of explanations for these two different types of beings. Either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. Okay, now let's deal with this category because this is the category that we're the most familiar with. Everything around us, coffee cups, electronic devices, this is my beloved Kindle here, a pen, a table, about 99.999% of the things that we are familiar with, and it's actually probably a higher percentage than that, are what we call contingent or dependent objects or contingent beings. In other words, the reason for the existence of this coffee cup, the reason for its existence does not lie within itself. The reason for its existence lies in an external object, an object outside of itself. So it was put together by a person. Its reason for existence does not lie within the coffee cup itself. This is a dependent object. What's it dependent upon? Well, it's dependent upon the person that made it, that assembled it, that designed it, that is the explanation for its existence. So almost everything that we know of falls into this contingent category. And as I said, people are contingent. Chairs, tables, horses, hippopotami, cacti, lizards, birds, your computer right now. All of these things are contingent. None of these things exist through their own power. They have been assembled, put together, built, constructed, etc. From an external cause. So that's pretty understandable because we're pretty familiar with this. Contingent objects, or we could also say they're dependent objects, that's pretty familiar to us. That category is somewhat understood by most people. But the problem comes sometimes when we talk about this other category. So here is contingent, here is dependent objects, but this other category that Leibniz refers to in this modified first premise here, everything that exists has an explanation either in an external cause or in the necessity of its own nature. This is a very unique category. Some people would say that very few things are here, but in Christianity, in the Christian theology, in the Christian worldview, the Christian philosophy, we would say that there's really one being in this category, namely God. Now the question needs to be answered, what is a necessary being? What is a necessary object or thing or being? Well, just as a contingent object or a dependent object has the cause for its own existence, it lies in an external object outside of itself, beyond itself. So a necessary object, the cause for its own existence, lies within itself. It's not a self-caused being. That's a logical contradiction. That's not what we're saying. But a necessary being is a being that, there's different ways to describe it. A necessary being is a being that it is impossible for it not to exist. Just as it is, it's impossible for a contingent object to make itself exist forever. It doesn't lie, for example, within a human. I don't have the ability to make myself exist forever, to not go out of existence, to somehow modify or change myself to become like that. It doesn't lie within the scope of my potentialities or my abilities. So for a necessary being, it's not possible for a necessary being to go out of existence. And hence, that's why we use the word a necessary being or a necessary object. Now, some people think that there's other beings or things outside of God himself that qualify as necessary objects. Now, I say other people because I don't necessarily agree with this at all, but I'm just going to try to mention some of them to you so you can kind of explain what I'm thinking about here. Now, let me just tell you that most of these things are pretty odd, but all it really does, it goes to underscore the fact that we are very unfamiliar most of the time with this category because, as I said, 99.9999% of our experience lies with objects in this category of contingent beings, contingent objects. So when we think of objects in this category, it seems extremely bizarre and it feels very uncomfortable or unfamiliar. So let me just give you an example. The truth that 1 + 1 = 2 is a necessary truth. So a way to understand that is that that truth always must be true, and it could never not be true. Okay? It's just a necessary truth. Another way to explain it is this. In any possible world that you could ever imagine, in other words, any possible way that reality could be or could have been, it would always have to be the case that 1 + 1 = 2. It's a necessary truth. Okay? It's not simply a matter of the fact that, well, it's just true in our universe because those are the numbers that we use, etc. This is a mathematical, logical truth that 1 + 1 = 2. Okay? From the Christian worldview, we would also say that there are certain Well, let me just put it like this. Let me see. What else can we think of here? Propositions. Propositions, for example, some people, I'm not saying that I agree with this, but some people, some philosophers, some thinkers, they would agree that propositions are true. For example, in English, I could say the snow is white. In German, I could say der Schnee ist weiß. Or I could say in Spanish, el nieve es blanco. But see, even though those sentences are all different, the truth content of each sentence is the same. The snow is white. And so that's what we call a proposition. It's the truth content of a declarative sentence. And so that proposition, it's a necessary truth, a necessary object, according to some people. So certain propositions, numbers, the number 1, the number 2, the number 7, geometrical shapes, some people believe that to be true. For example, a triangle, some people believe that certain geometrical shapes, well, geometrical shapes in general are necessary objects, like a triangle must always have 3 sides. I know this sounds strange. I know that you probably would expect to hear the Alfred Hitchcock Twilight music playing in the background, but it just goes to show you that we don't think about this very often. We're not familiar with objects in this category because almost everything that we know of in our experience is from here. But here's kind of the idea that God is a type of being that in any possible world, God would have to exist, and God does exist in any possible world that could ever be. Let's see, a necessary object is one that it would be impossible for it not to exist. A necessary object exists in every possible world, in stark contrast with contingent objects. As I said, necessary objects are said to be numbers, geometrical shapes, propositions, properties, and for the Christian, the one true God. Now, this idea of everything needs to have an explanation for its existence, it seems intuitively correct. It just seems like common sense. And oftentimes that can be good enough for just accepting the truth of a premise. It seems intuitively correct that everything has to have an explanation for its existence. Because, as I said earlier, what would be the alternative? Well, that things could exist without any explanation whatsoever. Just come into being without an explanation. So, Richard Taylor, a well-known thinker, he has an example of this. Imagine if you're walking in the forest. Imagine if you're walking in the forest and you find a translucent ball. Kind of a glowing ball, let's say the size of a basketball, and it's on the floor of the forest as you're walking through the forest with your friend. Now keep in mind, the reason I'm bringing this up, the reason Richard Taylor brings this up, and guys like William Lane Craig cite this example, is because some people believe that certain objects, like the universe, don't need an explanation for their existence, that they are exempt from this principle, that everything that exists has an explanation for its existence. They believe that the universe is exempt from this principle. Not even the Christian exempts God from this principle, yet the atheist will oftentimes exempt the universe from this. So Richard Taylor says, imagine you're walking through the forest and you see this glowing orb, this glowing sphere on the forest floor. It's a basketball. The size of a basketball, rather. And so there you are with your friend, and you're walking by, and you see this thing on the ground, and he asks you, he says, wow, I wonder how that got there. I wonder what the explanation is for that glowing ball on the floor of the forest. And you simply turn to your friend and say, nah, it doesn't need an explanation. And he would say, well, of course it needs an explanation of its existence. And you think about it for a while, and you say, yeah, I guess you're right. I guess a glowing, translucent orb lying on the floor of the forest does need and does have an explanation for its existence. Okay, so if that's true, size of a basketball, increase the size. Say, let's say from a basketball to the size of a car. Does it still need an explanation for its existence? Well, of course it does. Merely increasing the ball by size doesn't do away with the need of this principle, the truth of this principle. Merely increasing it by size. So increase it from the size of a car to, say, the size of the earth. Would it still need an explanation for its existence? Absolutely. Increase it to the size, then, of the universe. Would it still need an explanation for its existence? Yes, it would. Now, some atheists would say, well, no, you don't need an explanation at that point. The universe itself doesn't have and doesn't need an explanation for its existence. It simply just exists as a brute fact of nature. It doesn't exist. Well, a man named Arthur Schopenhauer, an atheist philosopher from the 1800s, he actually commented on that type of thinking, and he called it the taxicab fallacy. Just like in a taxi cab, when you take a cab and you can get out wherever you want to along the way, Arthur Schopenhauer, an atheist, mind you, he said, you cannot simply follow a line of thinking and then just get out as if you're getting out of a taxi when it feels convenient for you. So in other words, you cannot just simply agree with the premise that everything that exists has an explanation for its existence all the way through certain examples until you get to the universe, and then you just opt out of that. He says that commits the fallacy of the taxi cab. The taxi cab fallacy that you just don't need to explain the existence of the universe simply due to its enormous size. That somehow exempts it from this principle. But it's not just with a large-scale example. We also can have a small-scale example of this, because there's also certain people that try to pull that trick at the subatomic level. There's all kinds of fascinating and interesting things happening in the world of, quantum physics and quantum particles and quantum mechanics, but a lot of times it's used in kind of an intellectually dishonest way. And so some people, they'll say, well, that principle doesn't really hold true because there are certain subatomic particles that just pop in and out of existence without a cause, without an explanation. And so it's kind of the same idea, trying to exempt something from this principle, not because of its large scale, but because of its tiny scale. And I would call that the Heisenberg fallacy. In other words, there's a principle, the Heisenberg indeterminacy principle, or principle of indeterminacy, that you may not be able to predict, when or where a subatomic particle may come in or out of existence, but it certainly doesn't mean that it's without an explanation, and it certainly doesn't mean that it's without a cause. Coming into existence out of a vacuum is not coming into existence out of nothingness. The vacuum is not nothingness. But as William Lane Craig often says, this is a fluctuating field of energy endowed with a rich physical structure, and it's the farthest thing away from nothingness. And particles come in and out of being, and they simply change forms from energy to particle and particle to energy, but it's not as if they're coming into and out of existence from nothingness to nothingness without a cause, without an explanation. That's simply not true. So it's not logically consistent to try to exempt anything from this principle, either due to the large scaleness of the thing or the small scale of the object either. So you have to be aware of that as well. Keep in mind, this is a metaphysical principle. It's not a physical principle. It's a metaphysical principle. So it goes kind of beyond the physical realm. It's just a metaphysical, philosophical principle, a truth that everything that everything that exists has an explanation. Again, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. And as we'll see as we continue to talk about this, it does appear from Scripture, but then also from philosophical reasoning, that if it's even possible that God exists, being a necessary being is actually part of the definition of what it means to be the capital G God. This is a being that he happens to be the ground of all being. He is the necessary being that is the backstop of all contingent beings. One contingent object will find its explanation for its existence in an external cause, but that object finds its existence in an external cause, and so on and so forth and so on and so forth. But here's the thing, if all that we know existed were contingent objects, simply by realizing that as a whole, that would still not answer the question, why does anything exist? Because you cannot find the existence of all contingent objects within other contingent objects. This would just go back forever, and it would never stop. That's what you call an infinite regress. This chain backwards of contingent objects would just keep on going, and it would never have a stopping point. It would never have a foundation. And so the only logical, rational stopping point or explanation of this, the answer to this question, is that though most things we're familiar with are contingent objects, there must eventually be a necessary independent object that is the ground or the source of being for all these other contingent objects. A necessary being that must exist in every possible world and does exist in every possible world. It's impossible for this being to not exist, and that is why there is something rather than nothing. Because the necessary being itself can never fail to exist, and so there will always be something. It's logically impossible then for a world to exist, for a possible world to exist where there is nothing. There will always be this necessary being, and that is the answer to the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Why are there all of these contingent things? It can't go back forever in an infinite regress chain of contingent objects. It must eventually stop somewhere, and there's a necessary being that upholds all contingent beings in their existence. And that, of course, is who the Christian calls God. So we haven't gotten there yet. I'm just simply explaining what a necessary being is. All we've tried to do in this video, and I gotta stop, is that we've just been trying to demonstrate the plausibility of the premise that everything that exists has an explanation for its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature, that is God, or in an external cause, that's everything else. And according to the Christian worldview and philosophy, numbers, propositions, geometric shapes, all those things that we talked about, a great way to understand that is, as St. Augustine said, it's called divine conceptualism, that these objects exist in the mind of God. He sustains them, He created them. That's how we know that those objects are actually real, those abstract, necessary objects in the mind of God. So, does that premise seem true to you? Does it seem plausible? Does it seem realistic that everything that exists has an explanation for its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause? I think so. I think that principle is more plausible than its negation. That things would, just for no reason at all, come into existence. Whether it's a universe, a translucent ball, or a subatomic particle, that just doesn't happen to be the case. There's nothing about the universe that we know that would make it a necessary object, and it would be impossible for it to pass out of existence, or a quark. But we do know metaphysically, through philosophy, through logic, that there must be a metaphysical stopping point, a ground of being, a necessary object that exists to uphold all other things. So not even God is exempt from this principle. He also has an explanation for His existence. It's within the necessity of His own nature. So that's the first premise. We'll cover the rest of the premises and the conclusion in our next video. Okay? Encourage you guys to look into this. Leibniz's cosmological argument from contingency, or you could say from sufficient reason. And until then, guys, till next time, have an intelligent faith. God bless you.